Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about using the box squat to build our sumo deadlift. This is one of the things to where when you look at the movement pattern, now I'm obviously doing speed pulls and speed boxes with the safety bar above, but when we're doing any form of sumo deadlifting, one of the things that you get very frequently with people who start out with it is that they find they don't have the mobility to perform the sumo deadlift. And yes, I mean mobility in this context, meaning strength at the terminal ends of the range of motion. They might lack the range of motion, but they very, very frequently have muscle weaknesses in their abductors, adductors, and their vastus medialis. Okay, it tends to be very, very common, extremely common in people when they first start trying to sumo deadlift. And when we're talking about general build-up and building power, building explosiveness, building size, the sumo deadlift is a very, very valuable exercise. To the point where at least one coach I know who, even for his bodybuilders, he has them do a lot of their posterior chain work even with deficit sumos. And it builds their whole posterior chain up quite effectively. So he's a big fan of that. So even for hypertrophy purposes, the sumo deadlift is a reasonably valuable movement. Now, I'm obviously a bigger fan of the conventional, but I have most of my lifters do sumo, almost all of them. Some of them do both, right? Some of them we do both, and a lot of them we only use a conventional to max out on. And if we do anything other than maxes on the deadlift, we do deficit work. But I have them do a lot of sumo pulling, and it's because it's an exercise in which we can do a lot of volume and it brings a lot to the table. How you feel about it from a powerlifting perspective is largely irrelevant because the sumo deadlift can build the conventional anyways. And Matt Winning is someone who's talked about that quite a bit, who again has his own coaching service. He was at Westside for quite a while. I believe he has a PhD in exercise science, and he even feels that, look, the sumo deadlift can be trained at a much, much higher frequency. It will build the conventional deadlift. It'll build the conventional deadlift. And I demonstrated that last year. Right, I demonstrated that last year. Used box squat, sumo deadlifts, and supplemental lifts to build a conventional without having done any, and now I've pulled 615. So there's certainly a large degree of truth to that. But just like the sumo can build a conventional, what we find is that the box squat can build the sumo deadlift. A lot of people would say, well, why? How does it do that? Well, if you think of all the muscles that tend to be weak on the sumo deadlift when we can't get into position, right? When we can't get into position, and by the way, for anyone who's looking at those sumos, that was the very first time I've sumoed in months. I've been doing only conventional, so they're a little rough even for speed pulls. But look at the box squat itself, okay? Assuming a wide stance, and in this case, I'm not going ultra wide, but let's assume that you struggle to get into the correct position and have power out of the bottom of a sumo, be able to pull yourself into a deep enough squat. If you start doing wider and wider box squatting, what happens? Well, you develop the range of motion to do the sumo. Because a lot of times when we box squat, we go out to a foot position very similar to the sumo there, don't we? It's quite common. And it's much easier to do that than on a conventional back squat. Now, people might say, well, couldn't you just do that with the sumo? It's like, well, no, not necessarily. Because the difference is when you're trying to get into those positions on sumo, just like you saw there, I could stand to have gone a hair deeper. First time doing it again. So when you try to get into those positions, you have to pull your body into the position. Okay? So to get into the stretched positions you kind of need to be in, you have to physically pull yourself there. Now, doing that over and over and over can be fairly fatiguing if you don't have the range of motion or the mobility to do so. But when we do the box squat, we're forced to use a lighter weight for a similar movement pattern. We don't have to pull ourselves into that position, do we? No, we don't have to pull ourselves into that position at all. The weight on our back will push us mechanically into that position while we try to resist it. Okay? It will pull us into that sitting down position, particularly with the wider footing. It'll push us into it, and therefore it creates a stretch against resistance. And because we've got the box there, we can drop into it and we can hold that stretch position for a moment and then explode out of it. There's a big difference between having to pull yourself into it and strain against it versus having a weight push you into that position and be able to hold you there briefly for a 1 count and then exploding against it. The box squat builds your mobility. Okay? And because it's from a terminal stop, it's not like a normal back squat with a stretch reflex. We're having to come to a terminal stop, get stretched into that position, and then we explode up. The movement itself is very, very similar to a sumo deadlift. And some people would argue, again, when you do the safety bar like I'm doing, again, it's even more so because it will try to pull you forward more. Just like the deadlift will try to pull you forward because of the center of gravity on the bar. It will train the sumo deadlift. And if it trains most of the same muscles, or at least all the muscles of the lower body, and it does, it trains all the muscles of the lower body to perform a sumo deadlift. It does so with a lighter weight, therefore we can get away with more total training volume. And in the case of what I'm doing here in this clip, because this is just actually from one of my recent speed days, all these were done in the same workout, but obviously squats first, then deadlift second. We can do both then, can't we? And we can split the workload up because we can't handle nothing but the sumo. We can split them up, and a big chunk of our training volume can come from the easier to recover from box squat. And that box squat is still training all the muscles of the lower body for the sumo deadlift, and it's also doing it into a deeper position. Okay, it's doing it into a deeper position, but they're a very, very similar movement. So much so that when I get clients who struggle to sumo deadlift without their hips shooting up, right? And it's usually a sign of glute and hamstring weakness. But you get people who, when they try to sumo deadlift, the hips and the ass shoot way up in the air, right? They shoot up before they're able to break it off the floor. The box squat, you can basically do a sumo deadlift box squat. You say, well, how would you do that? Well, you just roll the bar over to the box squat, and you sit down like into a box squat, and you sumo deadlift off of that. So you reach down and you grab the weight in front of you, and usually it works on a bench. Like a high box works better. So you could do that on a standard bench over on the corner of a bench, at the edge of a bench. Roll the bar over to it, go into a sumo stance, sit down onto the box, grab the weight, and then stand up. And that will teach the movement pattern to keep the hips down. Because you can just box squat it up while staying upright. Okay, there's a solution. That will actually fix a movement problem in the sumo deadlift by teaching you just how to move correctly and to, again, help build the appropriate muscles up until you're used to it. It forces you to use a lighter weight, but maybe some guys are trying to sumo deadlift more than they can break off the ground correctly with their glutes. So this forces them to use their glutes to break the weight. So this is still another form of box squat that's a hybrid between the two that will, again, correct the problem. And it's very, very effective for it. I've used it already for people, and sometimes within 2 to 3 weeks it sorts the problem. As long as they keep the weight reasonable on the sumo and try to sumo more than their lower body can handle. But then the beauty of it is the box squat will continue to build those muscles that they need, right? It'll build the muscles that they need for it, particularly if you combine it with good mornings. And the good morning, of course, will train the conventional deadlift. So realistically, we can use these three tools together to build both the sumo deadlift and the conventional deadlift, right? They'll just make you strong across the board. It'll give you strong lower body and back to just use this trifecta of movements together. But the thing to remember is that the box squat itself will train the movement and the majority of the muscles involved with the sumo deadlift. So even though we might treat it as a primary exercise, and again, I believe it's a foundation building exercise, it's also probably the most effective supplemental lift for the sumo deadlift. So again, if you want to learn how to sumo, you need to box squat. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.